a lot of times in marketing and sales, we are trying to move the most difficult levers to move. And I was just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And what I mean by that is that we're taught, and I know this, I mean, I've spent 6 years in business school, so I know this, we're taught to try to create a need, right? Or if it's, in the best case scenario, we're taught to activate a latent need. But a lot of the times the way that we're taught to do that is to create a gap, right? Is to activate pain, is to create a fear of missing out, And so essentially we're constantly trying to get people to want things that they don't want, or we're trying to tell them to not want things that they already do. We're trying to get them to believe things that they don't already believe. We're trying to convince them based on, all our features and benefits, why, trust us. We can't exactly tell you why you're going to get all these features and benefits, but you will if you buy this, right? That that is the hardest way to make the case. And so what I discovered was, if we can in fact make our case within the context of what our clients and customers already want, what are they already curious about, what do they already believe, then we don't have to spend all that effort, time, and resources trying to move mental mountains in order to get people where we're going.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang, I'm excited today because you're going to learn how the possible or possibly how one little string could change your world forever. It's because I have Tamsen Webster on the show with me today. Tamsen, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, Jim, and to meet your B2B DM gang.
Well, and before we get into many of the discussion points that are going to actually excite me, as well as I'm sure many of our listeners, if you could tell us a little bit of background about you and the value you bring.
Sure. Well, you just said that you were a sales guy that was forced to learn digital marketing. And my response was, oh, I'm a marketing person that was forced to learn sales messaging. And that's very much the case. I've spent 25 years now in brand and message strategy, from everything from nonprofits, for-profits, in agencies, in organizations, just a really wide range. But when it really comes down to making marketing work, these high-level messages about how a company wants to be seen, so often that comes down to, well, how do you do it day in, day out? How does your sales team interpret it? How can they take this tagline and actually turn it into a conversation that isn't just like, hey, here's our new tagline? And also, how do you take something that is those big ideas and the needs of your sales force and turn it into something that you can use day to day in your content? So I have kind of seen it from all sides. And so my work really is trying to solve the problems that I saw most often from all those different perspectives.
Well, and those are plentiful in all organizations of all sizes. That's for sure. Now, you're also the author of Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Business Ideas Irresistible. And for me, I had mentioned to you how there's just so much information, and for me, it provides so much clarity with some of the things that I've struggled with, that I'm looking forward to our discussion and people's exploration, into your book, and even probably playing this episode over and again, and in their their replays, to be able to get all the nuggets. Okay, so in the book, yeah, well, it's going to happen. I know, because for me,
all right, good.
I now know. So for me, I probably shouldn't share this publicly, but I will, because it's you. Is a lot of the books and authors that I have on the show, I don't necessarily go back and read word for word the books, because there's only so much time that we have, and I'm doing these on a day-to-day basis. And yours absolutely will be one of those that I read.
Oh, yay.
So good. All right. So in the book, you talk about the red thread actually being an expression.
Yes.
And for those of you like me, I was not familiar with it. Explain what the red thread is.
The red thread is used as an expression, oftentimes is to ask, like, what's the big idea of something? What's the red thread here? What's the theme? What's the thing that makes this make sense? I became familiar with it through some clients that I had that were from Sweden, and where it is a fairly common idiom for them to be used exactly that way. When you're like, hey, I don't understand what's the big message here that I should get across. And since given, we're talking about from marketing and from sales messaging and even from digital marketing, what is the idea is a question you need to know the answer to. When I went looking for something to call this approach that I developed, I was like, you know what? Why don't I call it the red thread? It's this just beautifully visceral, evocative term that is exactly what I'm trying to help people develop. But it also has a backstory, or rather backstories, plural, around why it's called the red thread that were very, very applicable and relevant to the process itself.
And so needless to say, the book tour is going to be starting in those countries.
Oh, yeah. Yes, please. Let's start in Greece and in Asia. I would love that. That would be fun.
Okay. So now when we start talking about the red thread, you talk about the book being an example of the red thread at work.
Yes.
And you can use it to build upon your idea. Explain that a little bit.
Well, the opening line of the book is actually the book could have been one sentence, that the best way to build an irresistible idea is to build the story that people will tell themselves about it. And even that first line is an example of what the book is going to be able to help you produce, which is a one-line summary of what your idea is. And that summary is able to contain something people want and via a means that they don't expect. And so that's just one quick example, but every chapter of the book, even the structure of the book and the idea of the book, was built using the methodology that the book is about, because I really wanted people to see that even if you do come up with that one sentence or that storyline, which is like a one paragraph version of explaining the case, that you can expand how you talk about an idea to book length. You can use it to be the basis of your whole marketing strategy and communications and content plan. And in fact, the basis of your whole business, as it is for me. So it was really important for me that I lived the process that I was teaching people, because I think that's part of what helps people really understand. They can go back, they can actually see the structure, they can see the methodology at work in the book itself.
Well, you also in the book say that basically everybody has a red thread, and oftentimes we're just following a red thread unwittingly. Well, what does that mean?
I have 100% believe that. Yes. Yes.
So explain that a little bit.
Well, so the way, one of the reasons, so at the heart of the red thread approach is actually story structure, which is a slightly different thing than storytelling. So there's a lot of things out there right now in marketing, digital marketing, sales, about, you have to tell stories, which are really important. But if you understand why stories are important, then you start to reveal some of the things that are why I brought the red thread to life. And that is that we as humans create stories, and I'll explain more about that in a minute, in order to just explain how the world works, right? In order to understand the red thread of something, the big idea of something, we're constantly creating explanations in our mind, rationalizations. And these brain stories, essentially these explanations that we make up based on what we understand about the world, are really key to how we do that and how we see the world and what we do in it over and over again. Now, what's interesting is that the elements of these brain stories, these rationalizations, are consistent, across humans. We're all looking for the same kinds of information. But each of us fills in the blanks of those stories. It's kind of like a story with holes, but we each fill in those blanks in a unique way. We're drawn to answer certain questions over and over again. We're drawn to close certain kinds of gaps. There are some fundamental assumptions that we have about the world. And those things, when you start to look at them, once you make them explicit, which is what I hope the red thread method that I developed helps people do, you start to see these incredibly consistent patterns in what you do with your life and with your business.
Well, you also mentioned something, a difference between, what is cognitive and what is subconscious and all of that. And I think that, as you said that, I think that also comes into play as well. So for example, unwittingly, there's a lot of, subconscious and unconscious type of actions and behaviors and things that we're executing on a day-to-day basis, and be able to get things to a cognitive state so that maybe we now become aware and can make some changes. That's not easy for us, right?
No, it's not. I mean, it's not because it's not our first response, right? Our first response is just to operate through the world as we think that it works. And we don't really step back and look at what psychologists and educators call metacognition, the how we think about what we think. And think about the power that is in your hands once you start to understand how you either individually or organizationally, how you think about things, like what is the way that you reach decisions about things, because that explains a lot. It explains about why sometimes there's a gap between what you say your brand is and what your actual actions as a company are. It explains why there's sometimes major disconnects maybe between you and somebody you work with or a family member. Just being able to understand those kind of fundamental differences about how you think, about what you think, really puts, I think, a whole toolbox of understanding not only yourself, but your clients and customers into your hands that I think we just really haven't paid enough attention to yet.
Well, and so let's flip that a little bit. And look at it from a different viewpoint. We're trying to accomplish that in order to be able to sell our products and services to other organizations. And, they're essentially doing some of the same things, from a conscious and subconscious perspective. And, and we're trying to actually decipher all of that so that when we present them with our solution, they're saying, oh, I get how that works. Yeah. But that's not what happens.
No. Yeah, it is and it isn't. I mean, okay. It's one of those things like, just to mention a couple of things that I said in the book, there's a business school professor at Harvard, Gerald Zaltman, who says that 95% of our decision-making is unconscious, of our processing of information is unconscious. So the vast majority of what we do every day is reliant on this kind of operating system of how we think. And you're right. In order to do our job as marketers, as salespeople, it's really important for us to be able to get into the minds of our customers in that way. Because once we can understand how they think about something, it's much, much easier to understand how they could come to see our products and services as the right ones for them, or why they wouldn't, or why they don't right now, and how we can start to close that gap. So I think it's a really incredible and important insight that you bring up, Jim, because I think the folks in our business that can do that are the ones, that explains why there's certain people in our business that are super, super good and super, super effective at it. It's usually because they've been able to develop that skill really, really well.
Well, and you even talk about that whole, for me, I thought about something when you were actually presenting that in the book. And it reminded me to connect with Chip and Dan Heath's concept of, having the curse of knowledge, because we know so much about our products and services and things like that we're unable, to convey those to our targets and prospects, and heck, for that matter, even existing customers, and we're trying to get them to purchase other solutions from us. I mean, there's a whole lot of, ways that could fail us.
Oh, yes.
But you also talk, even ourselves, right? But then you also talk about how you review Tedx applications.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And to me, it's putting those two things together. And you even mentioned of all the ones that you reviewed, there was only one that actually was able to explain, what they did and the impact that they have. Maybe you'll share with us who that is. But if someone was to come to me based on all the things we just talked about now, and they said, how do I become a TEDx speaker? What should I tell them?
Well, I'll tell you what I say to them, and it's actually a question. And I say, why do you want to do it? Because I think a lot of times people see TEDx's as, another element of a marketing plan. And if that's the primary reason why you're doing it, you're likely not going to be successful getting one, because, speaking on behalf of fellow TEDx organizers, we can tell in a second when someone isn't doing it because of the idea. They're doing it to be self-serving. But that's one of those places where it's really important to understand kind of like your audience and where it's coming from. I mean, TED is all about ideas worth spreading. It's about giving a platform to ideas that don't yet have them. And so, if you're a company, if you're already a professional speaker, the way that TED looks at it is that you already have a platform. And so just from that standpoint. But the other thing is, and this is a personal thing. This is the way that I look at it and the way that I decide which clients and companies to work with, is that it's very important for me personally to work with people who serve ideas that are bigger than they are, that serve ideas bigger than themselves. And one of the reasons why I have loved working with the TED organization for so long now, 8 years and counting, is because that they're like that too. So you can see that if somebody wants to do a TEDx because they think it'll be good for their brand, or they think it's going to, go viral, as I had someone ask me about the other day, like, well, this is what we wanted to do. I really more often than not actually talk people out of it, because I respect and love these ideas so much. So the first thing is, why are you doing it? And the best reason to do a TEDx is because you can't imagine not doing it. That idea is so important to you to get out there. And it's so important that the people you think would benefit the most from it hear it, that you can't imagine not doing it. Because they're a lot of work. I've got to tell you, they are a huge amount of work to do and to do well. And for the average entrepreneur, you really have to think to yourself, can I spare the 70, 80, 90, 100 hours that this is going to take for me to really do this well, particularly if you're looking for those high level outcomes. So, yeah.
Well, and you talk about the Tedx test in the book.
Well, I do. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's what, kind of connected all that, the curse of knowledge, the Tedx test, and is, to be able to explain that. So where when people are asking, for example, what's your elevator pitch? What do you do? How do you make a difference? How do you do all that? How to do it in a way by which, and it doesn't matter what their level of understanding of what you do is, they're like, oh, I get it.
Yeah. So the TEDx test happens very early in the book. And it is the test of asking people to write down their idea. So I just ask them to do that. And then I run them through a series of quick questions afterward that include things like, is it a sentence? Is it 140 characters or less? Does it use only words that your potential audience would already understand without any deep explanation? Does it simultaneously give them something that they want while also giving them a means to get that they don't expect, so something that they want via means they don't expect. And out of the gate, it's really hard for most people to do that. And I don't expect most people to do that. That's why my clients hire me, so they can get to a point where they can do that. But it is, there's a reason why I opened the book there, because it's usually the thing that people need, right? Most people say, well, they don't know how to answer well the question, what do you do? Or what are you going to present about today? Or why should I hire you? Or why should I buy from you? As much as that is such a central, like the answer to that question is so central to our work, I think you and I have all probably both been in a situation where someone asks us that, and even though it's like our life's work, we're just like, or we spend 20 minutes, trying to explain something that somebody really just wanted a really quick answer to.
Well, and as I was going through this book, I started questioning some things that have become somewhat consistent staples for marketers and people in the selling world, and I'm starting to see it being proliferated in customer service and all kinds of different areas. And that is the work about creating personas so that we can, empathetically better connect to, the people who are trying to influence and impact. And as I started going through, I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe do I need to question that concept? And maybe we need to start doing like red thread personas.
I love that shift. Yeah. I think that, so my husband, full disclosure, I have an undergraduate degree in market research, and my husband's a market researcher, and neither of us really love the idea of buyer personas. I mean, because the biggest challenge is that done well, they're a really helpful tool. But more often than not, what I find is that buyer personas are aspirational at best. You're essentially outlining the people that would be interested already at some level in what you're doing. Again, this is not 100% true. It is a sweeping generalization, which I grant you. But more often than not, you're trying to sell to people who don't already know that you're the right answer or don't think that you are. And so I find it's much more useful. I mean, again, this comes back to the years that I spent in an under-resourced marketing, in under-resourced marketing departments, trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the quickest way to get in front of these people? And what I found generally is that, the personas broke down really quickly. And that what was more effective as a way to group, my efforts in messaging was their starting point. And I talk about it in the book as their goal question, but what questions are people asking right now? Or what question is someone asking right now that my product, my service, my organization is an answer for? It's kind of, I think the equivalent is, thinking about it this way is just that, one of my favorite examples and brands is like Converse shoes. And, one of the reasons why Converse has been so successful, I think, for so many years is that they understand that not every 25 to 34-year-old is going to be their customer. They don't. They understand that there's actually what unites their customers is a slight counterculturalism, as it's a, there's a creativity in it. There's aspects, and that allows them to appeal to everything from teenagers to, the creative director of my former ad agency, this amazing, kind of rock and roller in his, late 50s, early 60s that, just collects amazing things, but just loves Converse shoes. So I think that's, when we start with where somebody is, it just ends up being a lot more powerful than talking about who they are. Because I think all that work and kind of building out this buyer persona and all these other things kind of can cloak the fact that they may not fundamentally actually be interested in our product or service.
Okay. So, if we're talking about connecting with people where they are, trying to help them to, attain those goals that are currently unmet, you start talking about having that one story that will connect, or that one idea that will connect, but then having infinite stories.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit when you said, hey, whether I'm doing a, marketing, or whether I'm doing website, or whether I'm doing a sales conversation, but if you can, take us to and help us understand that one idea and then infinite stories.
Yeah. So it goes back to that thing that I was mentioning earlier about story structure, about how when we as humans are trying to process information to make sense of an idea, we're looking for the same kinds of information. And so I'd like to think of it as like a Mad Lib. So have you ever played with that or had that as a game with your kids or adult? I don't know, but it's, it's like it's a pre-written story and then there's blanks in it and you're supposed to fill in the blanks with like a noun or a verb or whatever. And I think of these rationalizations, these red threads, these stories that we build in our minds to explain how the world works, very much like a Mad Lib, where the kinds of blanks that we have to fill in are always the same. And generally, our brain is trying to order those blanks so that they always fall in a very specific order. What will this get me? What's getting in the way? Why is that important? What do I need to do as a result? How do I do that? How well will it work? Really, that's kind of the process that we're going through. And so if you think of it in that way, that there's this framework that our brains are always trying to fill in, but that each of us fill in those blanks in our own way, based on our own unique worldview, our own experiences, our own, based on who we're talking to, based on the different things that we're trying to get out of it, based on the different places where we're using these messages. There really is, if it isn't actually infinite, then it's mathematically really, really close. And it's just it's a thing I've seen happen over and over again. Like no two people find the same red thread. They don't. And I don't think that they actually can, not if they're really pushing to find their own unique red thread, or their company's unique red thread. And to me, that's the fun work, is to really push past sometimes those first level ways that you would fill in those blanks and push deeper and deeper until you find the way that only you could fill in those blanks.
Okay. So to me, that just kind of tipped me over the edge of total confusion, right?
Okay. All right. Let me bring you back then.
Yep. Pull me back. So I'm trying to connect, with a particular target, either through a sales meeting or a marketing message. And if you're saying that I can't figure out a way by which they're going to fill in these blanks, then I shouldn't even make the attempt. That's where my fear goes.
No. Okay. So it's important to understand that the red thread really operates on at least two levels, but one is this kind of macro level of what is your core red thread? Why is it that you do what you do the way that you do it? And I think it's important for any organization to understand what that is. And the best way to find that is to look at it through the lens of as I say in the book, it's just to imagine it through the lens of a specific use case. Now, from a brand standpoint and a brand positioning standpoint, if you can't find a way to fill in those blanks that doesn't create an irresistible or an inarguable reason, for your potential audience, why you're the right answer for them, that's when you're going to be in trouble. As I say in the book, I believe everyone has that red thread. So you're only in trouble if you don't decide to do the work to find it, to push past the kind of surface level, we care about our customers, or we prioritize efficiency over effectiveness, or just the basic table stakes of doing business today. Push deeper to get to that point. So let me be super, super clear. I don't believe there's ever a situation where it's not, where you should just say, give up, go home now. Unless what has prompted that is your unwillingness to say that this idea or this organization or this audience is worth it for us to keep pushing.
Okay. So
did that clear it up?
It does. And I think for a lot of people, they talk about, at least in the sales and marketing world, about, cracking the code. Mm-hmm. Right. And how do I crack the code so that we actually have, greater growth? We're, getting better leads. We're, converting at a better rate. We're getting more referrals, and the growth is coming. How do we crack the code, as they talk about a lot? For me, I think the red thread is a code cracker.
I would love to think so. I certainly think so. I mean, I hope I do. It's my book. But I do. That's been my experience. As you and I were saying before we started the recording, I mean, in a lot of ways, the red thread, I built it to solve for a lot of the problems that I found doing this work, whether I was the person in charge of coming up with the messages because I was in the organization, or I was in charge of coming up with the messages for my clients when I was in agencies, or I was in the position of having to sell a client on this site, on a message that we'd come up with, or, to pitch new business or those kinds of things over and over and over again. I asked the same question, like, how can we crack the code? How can I start from a place that where the probability of success is already higher? And, that brought to mind that in my attempt to answer that, a couple of things started to become immediately clear. One is this standard way that we make sense of the world. So it really was like, okay, well, if I can break my idea into the components that somebody's brain is looking for anyway, I'm already going to be much more successful. The second point was to really understand that, a lot of times in marketing and sales, we are trying to move the most difficult levers to move. And I was just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And what I mean by that is that we're taught, and I know this, I mean, I've spent 6 years in business school, so I know this, we're taught to try to create a need, right? Or if it's, in the best case scenario, we're taught to activate a latent need. But a lot of the times the way that we're taught to do that is to create a gap, right? Is to activate pain, is to create a fear of missing out, and so essentially we're constantly trying to get people to want things that they don't want, or we're trying to tell them to not want things that they already do. We're trying to get them to believe things that they don't already believe. We're trying to convince them based on, all our features and benefits, why, trust us. We can't exactly tell you why you're going to get all these features and benefits, but you will if you buy this, right? That that is the hardest way to make the case. And so what I discovered was, if we can in fact make our case within the context of what our clients and customers already want. What are they already curious about? What do they already believe? Then we don't have to spend all that effort, time, and resources trying to like move mental mountains in order to get people where we're going. The third benefit that comes from that is you start to learn really quickly who you are not for and never will be. And that creates so much more efficiencies when you're talking about getting qualified leads. Most of the time, my experience is a lot of times, rightly so, a salesperson will say that a lead isn't qualified because it's too much work to get them where you need them to be. So by building messages that really only appeal to the people who are close enough to be able to convert, then you end up saving yourself, your sales team, everybody a lot of time and effort and money.
Okay. So primarily we've been talking about actually making a connection, right? So, how do we put together and have a red thread that's going to actually connect with people with what we can provide to help them solve for? Yep. But there's one thing that we know is true. That's not enough, right? So we need them to connect, and then we also have to have them take a particular action, which could be significantly difficult when you start, talking about moving them to the sales process from the marketing process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So tell us a little bit about how do I create a story that's actually going to, cause people to take action?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I love that you went there, Jim, because a lot of times, and I see this across my whole range of clients, when I ask them, like, well, what do you want to have happen from this? They're like, I want people to understand. And I was like, well, that's great. But you actually, I think as I write in the book, action is proof of understanding. The only way that you're absolutely sure that your message got across is if that person behaves in a way that's consistent with the fact that they agree with your message. And in order for them to act, they have to first understand it, which is what breaking down it into these idea components comes into play, into that story structure comes into play. And they have to agree with it. And that's where filling in those components in a certain way comes into play. So, I think the easiest way to describe this is to go back to the elements of story structure to say, okay, how do I create a connection that drives action? The first connection point, and I would argue because it's the most critical, is to establish what I call an audience goal. And that is the question that your audience is currently asking out loud to other people that your product, service, company, whatever is an answer for. So you want to think of this in terms of what would they Google? What are they, what does their boss ask them to solve? Like, what are the questions they're getting from their boss, or what are the questions they're asking of their team? What are they asking right now? That's a goal. And every story, both once upon a time stories and these, red thread rationalization stories, start there. That's when we get interested, is when we discover that somebody wants something that they don't yet have. So we start there. The second element to a message that's really critical when we're thinking about how do we create and build this kind of story of an idea is a problem that's getting in the way. So in once upon a time stories, it's always a problem that has to be solved before the person can get their goal, right? So their goal may represent a problem, but there's usually another problem they have to solve first. And it's a problem they didn't know about at the start. And in, what I've discovered with business messaging, that the kind of most effective way to build this in a way that is efficient and not painful for your audience is to frame it as a problem of perspective. And you don't necessarily want to say, well, hey, your problem, client, customer, is that you've got this gap in perspective, but you need to present it to you have to understand that if they don't make this shift, it becomes a problem for you. So there's I talk a lot more about that in the book, but it's that problem of perspective that gets in the way. Because what that establishes is first how most people look at it, and then it contrasts that with how you look at it. And that contrast is important because in addition to the curiosity that's built just from establishing that you're going to answer a question they don't have an answer to yet, once you say, hey, most people look at it this way, there's another way to look at it. Well, now you've built on that curiosity, and you've also created a gap between where they are now and another place to be. And just like curiosity, people don't like to leave that kind of gap open. So the next element is an element that absolutely comes from stories, and which I would say the vast majority, if I would put a number on it, 80, 90% of sales and marketing messages leave this piece out. And in a story, it's often called the moment of truth. There's a moment in every story where there's this realization or a discovery about the main character or the world. And in that moment, that character has to decide. They have to make a decision. They have to make a decision between what they want. So that goes back to that goal, what they actually believe to be true about the world, which is probably the thing that they just discovered or realized, and what they've been doing so far. This is that moment that if you've got something in your message that creates that, again, it's not going to be guaranteed, but it really jacks up the likelihood that someone will shift their thinking in some key way, is by introducing what I call a truth into it. So you've got this goal that establishes what they want, a problem that gets in the way of that goal, a truth that makes that problem impossible to ignore, right? And the reason why it makes it impossible to ignore is because it puts what they want in jeopardy. Now, if built well, they're not going to unwant something that they want, and they're not going to unbelieve this truth that is, in front of them. And so ideally what they're going to do is change. They're going to change their perspective. That goes back to that two-part problem. And they're going to ideally do something different as a result of that. So that's that fourth piece, is like, what's the high level shift in thinking or behavior that you want to have happen? And then finally, what are the actions that are required to make that change in play? So it's goal, problem, truth, change, action. And if you can find those elements for your idea, then that creates what I refer to, officially in the book as a storyline, but in practical terms, it really becomes the minimum viable case for your idea. It really becomes the tightest, shortest, and strongest explanation for why your idea is the right one for the audience that you're talking to. And ideally, so irresistible that they won't, they A, can't unhear it, but B, just must think and therefore do something different as a result.
Okay. And we addressed this before off mic, and I want to bring it on mic because I think it's critically important. You've touched on it a couple times. And I think it is one of those amplification tools that oftentimes we just, for a multitude of different reasons, are unable to capitalize upon. And there's pun intended there. Is how much does curiosity play in our story and the actions that are taken?
It is so much. I mean, if you can't invoke curiosity, and a very specific kind of curiosity, out of the gate, you're kind of in trouble before you ever get started. And curiosity is really fascinating because curiosity follows a curve, and it's an upside down curve. So imagine the letter U, but now flip it over. And what research shows is that the less somebody knows about something, the less curious they are about it. Now, that's important because if you think, all you have to do is flip through any magazine or whatever, and you'll see some kind of advertising copy, whatever, that's trying to be mysterious and curiosity inducing without ever telling you what the thing is. That actually, people are negatively curious about those things. We believe somehow in the magical realism and magical thinking that someone will be so curious about this thing that they don't understand that they'll go look it up. Research full stop doesn't support it. We're just too busy. We got too many other things to think about. Now, on the other end of that curve, if somebody thinks they already know the answer to something, they are also negatively curious about it. And so this is where if you just, if you give someone, if they've asked essentially a question like a goal, and you give what seems a really obvious answer to them that doesn't have anything else embedded in it that's unexpected, they're not going to be curious about it. They're like, I already know that. I don't need to know anymore. Thanks, not paying attention. So what you really are trying to find is that magic middle in between where somebody knows enough to know what you're talking about, but not so much that they feel like they've already got that answer. And that's where that Tedx test that I also refer to as my irresistible idea formula comes into play, where, particularly if you're trying to give someone just a quick summary of the idea, you really want to combine something that they want via a means they don't expect. So that the best way to make your idea irresistible, something people want, is to build the stories people will tell themselves about it, means they don't expect, in one sentence. Because what you're doing there is saying, hey, this is something that you know enough to be curious about. I am interested in how to make my ideas more irresistible, or I want people to respond to my ideas more. But then you finish that off with something that they don't know about, and that creates this curiosity. And as I know you know, because we mentioned Made to Stick and Chip and Dan Heath, I mean, curiosity is a drive state. Meaning it's like hunger or sex. It is a condition where we as humans are compelled to satisfy it. So anytime you can create curiosity, you're in great shape. But the trick is, what I've really learned about this is it is not just about creating curiosity. You need to satisfy the current question and create curiosity about the next one kind of at every point. So each time you can do that, answer a question, open a gap, answer that, close that gap, open another one. What you're really doing is you're creating a mental process by which your audience is self-propelling through your message. They want to know more. And that's always going to be a much more powerful basis of messaging than, here, let me tell you this. Here's my next slide.
Well, and oftentimes we talk about closing the loop, closing the gaps, and, making things, be able to be connected to where, people will take the action. Because I think one of the things that's important about all of these factors is if we leave the confusion in place, we're going to have a problem. And if we're keeping and continuing to stack information on, we have to really be focused in on closing it back to the beginning. And that's kind of what you had talked about. You said tie it back to the beginning. But if you could explain it, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to stories and our brains listening to them, and particularly in this case, I'm talking about once upon a time stories, we sense intuitively, back to that unwitting, unconscious piece, that a story ends when we get an answer to the original question. So remember, there's, all stories start when we discover what the main character wants. And when we feel like we've gotten the answer to that question, did they or didn't they? Did they get their goal or did they not? And if they didn't, did they get something that they needed instead? That's the moment where we're like, okay, the story is over now. And so it's really important in your messaging and to make sure that not only do you open with that, what somebody wants, but to make sure that you go back and close that loop and say, and I like to build on to it. I like to yes and it. I like to use the phrase of Seth Godin, give people a free prize inside, meaning you close the loop and say, yes, not only will you be able to get an answer to this question, and here's how, but you will also be able to X, Y, and Z. And this is generally where you get to put all the things that your product or service will do and is of value, but that your prospects don't yet know is valuable, right? Because right now they're just figuring out how to increase their conversion rate, or they're trying to figure out how to improve operational efficiency or detect and avoid problems. And you want to get to, but your product and service can, help them, help their research and innovation process, and it can improve employee engagement and all this other stuff. But back to curiosity, if they're not interested in that stuff right now, you are wasting your time. You need to anchor it in what they're curious about now, but then close the loop. And once you've made the case that what you're suggesting, your product or service, will actually do what they're talking about, and they believe you, that's what the red thread does. Then you yes and it. Then you say, and now look at all the other stuff that you can get from that. And if you've made the case well, that stuff should now make sense. They're not just taking it on faith that they'll get these features and benefits. They really understand why those features and benefits are the product of the strategy that led to your idea. And
as I started, folks, that's how a small string could potentially change your world for the better. That's if you get Tamsen's book and you continue to listen to this particular episode. Tamsen Webster, I had a fun time chatting with you today. Can you please share with the B2B DM gang how they can get in touch with you?
Sure. I'm literally the only Tamsen Webster in the universe, so I'm not hard to find online. But best place, all things Tamsen, tamsenwebster.com, where they can find links to sign up to my newsletter. They can grab a copy of my book, anything that might be of interest to them, or just do a deep dive in messaging.
Tamsen Webster, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
My pleasure, Jim. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.